welcome you to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. We want to say a very special welcome to Tom Gooch, David Burnett, Arthur Kramer, Mark Twain, Marsalis, and Martin Weiss. Teachers, if you're watching it, you're not signed up, please do so. Go to www.tiny.cc/3-5 registration. Sign up for us, please. During this virtual field trip, students will observe the way organisms live and survive in their ecosystem by interacting with living and non-living components, describe the flow of energy within the food web, and predict the effects of changes in ecosystems caused by living organisms, including humans. Mr. Monroe will discuss ecosystems. Food webs will be talked to about Ms. Ram. All pellet investigation by Ms. Ramirez, and changes in ecosystem by Mr. Dominguez. Students, you cannot ask us questions, verbal questions during this program, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/question-answer, fill out a short question and send it to us, and we'll do our best to answer them during the program. If not, I'll send the questions to your teacher. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Mr. Monroe is going to tell you all about ecosystems.
My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking into ecosystem or ecosystems. In fact, what is an ecosystem? Well, it's a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. In other words, it's all the living things that live in a particular area that interact with one another, and they interact with their physical environment, which could be non-living components that are making up the environment in which they live. Now, when we talk about an organism, we're talking about things that are alive, right? It could be a plant, it could be an animal. And I do have an animal that, well, he's a kind of a perfect example. I kind of want you guys to remember this animal this organism as I go through my presentation with you. His name is Snappy. And Snappy is a regular snapping turtle. In fact, in the area that we live in North Texas, there are two well-known snapping turtles, the regular snapping turtle and then the alligator snapping turtle, which they're kind of hard to find right now, but let me get Snappy out. This is Snappy, the snapping turtle. I use him in a lot of the programs that I do out here simply to let students see examples of what we call adaptations. These are structural or behaviors that this animal or organism has to help him survive in the environment in which he lives. Now, I want you to remember him as an organism, okay? Later on in your virtual field trip with us today, you're going to learn about how animals like Snappy interact with other animals, maybe becoming part of a food chain or food web, but you'll learn about that a little later on, okay? Now, Snappy is about somewhere a little over 20-some years old. And this animal organism can live to be 50 years old and weigh as much as 50 pounds. He's very strong, and you can see he is adapted to living in water. So he has come from what we call a water ecosystem, a freshwater ecosystem. In fact, he came from our pond many, many years ago. I'm going to put him up for a little bit. Now, as I go through my presentation with you, there's a couple of things I want you to be thinking about. In fact, there's something that I'm hoping you'll be able to do at the very end of my presentation. And maybe your teacher will ask you questions about this. And that first question is, what makes up an ecosystem? In the presentation, you'll find out. And we know that ecosystems can be found everywhere. And I know that you as young people probably are interested in seeing animals, being around animals. And we know that animals make up a community that probably is in one of these ecosystems. So there's probably a favorite place that you like to go, maybe out in nature, that you would like to visit to see animals in an ecosystem. So I want you to be thinking about, as I finish up my presentation, which ecosystem you would like to visit and maybe why. Why would you have an interest in that particular ecosystem? Well, let's get started. And I'm going to get started by sharing a short PowerPoint with you that tells us all about ecosystems, or what it takes, or what parts make an ecosystem. Parts of an ecosystem. Now, we know, and I've already explained to you what an ecosystem is. Remember, it's a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. You know, we have studies out here, when students come to see us person to person, we have studies out here that are ecology-based studies. And what that means is they're going to be involved in studying the interactions between organisms and the environment. That's what that word ecology means. It's a very special study. Ecosystem is made up of all the living and non-living things that interact in a particular area. Ecosystems can be large or small. Ecosystems can be anywhere. The image that you see here with the trees, this is an ecosystem that is what we consider to be a mid-altitude forest. Now, out here at the Environmental Ed Center, we have 3 ecosystems that are represented out here. One is the grassland ecosystem. We know that many, many years ago, this area that we're living in now was part of what we call the Blackland Prairie, which is a grassland. And then we have across the street, which is an area that is going through some changes. We call it a forest, but it's not quite a forest yet. It's a savanna. We usually do an ecological program or a field study involving that particular ecosystem. And then we have what we call our pond or lake ecosystem. And that's where we do limnology and water studies about the living things and their interaction that living in that aquatic environment and the non-living elements that support life in that particular area. The living parts of an ecosystem are called biotic factors. Examples of these are trees, plants, flowers, insects, and animals. Things that are alive are considered to be biotic. The non-living things in an ecosystem are called abiotic factors. And examples of these are water, rocks, soil, air, temperature, wind, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and very important, sunlight. Now, ecosystem is a part of a bigger picture. The largest part, in fact, would be what we call the biosphere, the part of the earth that contains all ecosystems, the part of the world or part of the planet that all life exists in our world. Now, when we talk about the ecosystem, again, a community and its non-living surroundings. When we talk about a community, we're talking about populations that live together in a defined area. When we talk about a population, we're talking about a group of organisms, one type that lives in the same area. For example, Snappy, the snapping turtle that I showed you, he's an organism, but all the snapping turtles that are of his species that are in the pond, that would be the population. And then we have the organism, the individual living thing, which that would be an example of. I would use Snappy as an example of that. And then even broken down a little further, you know, there are groups of cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems that are found in Snappy. And what makes those are the cells, which is the smallest functional unit of life. And then in the cells, we have molecules, elements. Now, when we talk about the environment, ecologists have arranged environment in different levels, starting with organisms, okay? Next comes the population of those organisms. Then the community, that's all the different populations. And then the ecosystem itself. And then the biosphere. Now, an individual is a single organism, like this alligator. A population is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area. And then we have the community, which consists of all the populations of different species that live in and interact in an area. And then we have the ecosystem itself. Is made up of a community of organisms and its abiotic environment, the non-living parts of the environment. And then we have the biosphere. On Earth, that's where life exists. Now, let's look at this using the snapping turtle. The organism, it's snapping, the snapping turtle. The population would be all the groups of snapping turtles that live in that pond or in the lake that we're calling an ecosystem. And then the community would be all the living things that live and interact with each other, such as fish, frogs, snakes, egrets, whatever's living in that particular ecosystem would be the community. And then the ecosystem, things that would be combined with the living community and abiotic factors that might have an effect, the physical environment for those living things that live in that particular area. And then we have the biosphere where all life lives on our planet. Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hopefully I've given you an idea what an ecosystem is and the parts that make up an ecosystem. One more thing that you probably will help you remember. That word ecosystem ends with the syllable system. When we look at a system, guess what? That is a description of, or a way to describe a system would be parts working together to make the system work. I'm going to get Snappy out one more time so we can say goodbye to you guys. Because he's going to be happy to get back in that big aquarium in the back of my lab. He probably will go ahead and finish taking his good old nap that I have disturbed him from. I want you guys to have a good day the rest of the day. And I know that if any of you have any questions, I bet Dr. Gorman can answer those for you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. And Angel from Brashear School asked, how strong is the bite of a snapping turtle? About 209 newtons of force. Alligator snapping turtle has about 158 newtons of force. And in more common language, the snapping turtle can produce 1,000 pounds of force with her bite. And now Ms. Ram is going to tell you about food webs.
I'm Ms. Ram, and we are going to be learning all about food webs. So let me get this little screen going. And eventually it'll load. Okay, perfect. All right. So today we're going to be able to describe the flow of energy within a food web, including the role of the sun, producers, consumers, and decomposers. So we're going to be looking at a few different ecosystems, and we're going to be describing each of those roles for those ecosystems. So our essential questions are, what's the role of the sun? What is the role of producers? What is the role of consumers? And what is the role of decomposers? And we're even going to get a little more specific with consumers because we're going to talk about 3 different kinds. So let's begin with the sun. That's where it all starts. So what is the role of the sun? Well, you may have already known this, but the sun produces the power for the producers, right? So the producers get their energy first from the sun. Without the sun, the rest of the food web would not exist. So we have our sun providing energy to our producers, And guess what the producers do? It's right in their name. They produce their own energy. So the producers take the energy from the sun, and through processes like photosynthesis, they create their own energy. So the producers include plants, lichens, moss, bacteria, and algae. All of those living things that create their own energy. They are the producers. Without the producers, once again, just like the sun, the rest of the ecosystem could not exist. The rest of the food web would collapse, right? So we need the producers, because then comes the consumers. So first we have primary consumers, primary meaning first. So we have the first consumers. These are the ones that eat those plants. So these are herbivores, animals that consume only plant matter. So we've got our sun, we've got our producers, and then the primary consumers that eat those plants. So herbivores are animals that consume only plant matter. That includes rabbits, caterpillars, cows, sheep, deer. I was just lucky enough with Miss Ramirez, we just saw 11 huge deer coming past my classroom window, and they were out there eating corn from our feeder and all this goofy stuff. So they are out there being their little primary consumers. So let's go on to the next part, secondary consumers. So secondary consumers, they may still eat plants, but they also eat other animals. So you might not think of some of these as secondary consumers, but technically they are, because they eat insects and smaller organisms. So omnivores are animals that eat plants and animals, and carnivores are animals that eat other animals. So like frogs, spiders, and snakes. So omnivores, I put those little birds out there, especially chickens. I love raising chickens. I have quite a few out here at the environmental center. We have so many chickens all around, but chickens are a great example of secondary consumers because they eat plant matter, they eat seeds, they eat greens, they eat herbs, all sorts of stuff. Any kind of kitchen scrap you throw out there and they'll have it. But they also like to hunt for worms. A special treat we have out here for them is mealworms. They go crazy over those. So they eat little bugs and they also eat plants. So that makes them omnivores and secondary consumers. All right. And then of course we have so many reptiles and frogs that love eating smaller insects and crickets and things like that. But there are bigger animals, and those would be the tertiary consumers. So the tertiary consumers are carnivorous predators that eat the other animals. So we have an owl, an eagle, a lion, a shark. These are kind of more of your apex predators. They are the ones that are kind of bigger on a food chain that are going to eat those smaller animals that are eating smaller animals that are eating the producers that get their energy from the sun. Okay, so what is the role of decomposers? Well, decomposers, they are kind of like the cleanup crew. They break down dead animals and plant matter and return them to the soil. So it doesn't matter where you are in the food chain or where you are in the food web. When that animal dies or that organism dies or that plant dies, the decomposers break them down and to the chemical level and recycle them into new soil so more plants can grow. So this includes bacteria. I have a picture of a dung beetle, worms, and mushrooms and other kinds of fungi. So if we were to use a simple food chain, this is kind of helpful to remember who's the producer, who's the primary consumer, who's secondary, and who's tertiary. And then, of course, I should have included the decomposers here to kind of complete the chain. But basically, food chains are good for that purpose, just remembering everyone's role. And it shows a linear energy exchange. But we know ecosystems are more complicated than that. We don't just have 4 organisms, right? We don't just have grass, a grasshopper, a frog, and an owl. Right? We have a lot of different creatures living in ecosystems, and their interactions are more complicated than just one linear energy exchange. So a food web shows kind of a more dynamic energy exchange within the ecosystem. So we have multiple kinds of primary consumers, multiple kinds of secondary and tertiary consumers, all in this one food web, all in this one ecosystem. So, for example, I'll just go through the path of a mouse. So a mouse is a primary consumer because he eats the grass. Now, he could also be eaten by an owl. He could also be eaten by a hawk. He could also be eaten by a fox. Or he could die of old age and be decomposed by a decomposer. So it just depends. So food webs are a little more complicated. They show kind of all the possible interactions and energy exchanges within the ecosystem. So here are some more examples for you. We've kind of got a, like, it looks like African, not safari, savanna kind of environment. We got lions, we got owls, snakes, and they're kind of food web. And then we've got more of a forest ecosystem over here. And it just kind of shows you how these can interact with each other. I like this one on the right because it still makes it clear who's what role, but it also is quite complicated. As soon as you add more animals into that ecosystem, the food web expands. So my little challenge for you before I send you off is, can you create your own food web for a desert biome? So I've included some vultures, tarantulas, some roadrunners, millipedes, cactus, lizards, mice, and foxes and eagles. So if you were here live, I would give you these pictures all cut out already with some yarn or string, and you would be able to map it out. But I'm wondering if you could do that on your own. So that's my little challenge for you. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you next time.
Thank you, Ms. Ram. And we do have a question from Emily. From Brashear School. And she wants to know, where do we get all the animals from the at the environmental center? Sometimes we purchase them, and sometimes they are donated through people like FFA kids who have show animals, but they don't want to send them to market, so they donate them to us. So thank you again, Ms. Ram, and thank you, Emily from Brashear. And now Ms. Ramirez is going to do a program with oil pellets, owl pellets.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning all about owl pellets. So let me show you exactly what an owl pellet looks like, and then I'll give you guys some time to kind of just guess what you think an owl pellet is. And you'll learn about what exactly it is here in a second. And speaking of owl pellets, I do have an animal friend, but it's not alive. It's taxidermied. Taxidermy just means that this is the real owl. It's just not alive anymore. A taxidermist has taken their time to prepare the body and stuff it so that we can use it for educational purposes. So this happens to be a barn owl. And we know that owls are mostly nocturnal, meaning they come out during the nighttime. They're mostly going to be a predator animal. So they prey or eat other animals like rodents, maybe even some snakes or some insects. There are very few animals that might eat the owl. Examples might be a larger owl, or maybe if a coyote's lucky enough to get one. But for the most part, owls are at the top of the food chain. And so the owl, if you guys were able to touch him, you would feel that its feathers are super soft. And that's very important because that gives them the ability to have silent flight. So the poor little prey animal doesn't even know the owl's coming because they're super quiet when they fly. So we're going to go ahead and put our little owl friend up, and we'll start our presentation on what is an owl pellet and what are they used for. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and we'll look at a little video. So let me get that started. Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning all about owl pellets and the food web. So my focus questions for you guys are, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer these two questions. The first is, why do owls make owl pellets? And the second is, what do scientists use owl pellets for? So let's start off with, what exactly is an owl pellet? Well, it's not poop. It's actually a regurgitated mass of hair and bones. So think of it almost like when a cat coughs up a big hairball. And if you look at a couple of the videos here, you can see a couple of the images of these owls coughing up an owl pellet. Owls don't have teeth. Their food is simply swallowed. So it travels down the esophagus, which is like a throat, and it makes its way to the proventriculus, which is like a stomach, and then it goes into a very special organ called a gizzard. The science word for the gizzard is the ventriculus. Now, the gizzard is very important to birds because birds don't have teeth. So inside the gizzard will contract or squeeze, and that squeezing helps to grind and break down the food. Now, the digestible materials are able to move through the digestive system, but stuff that can't be digested, things like fur and bones, will eventually travel up through the esophagus or the throat, and then they will get coughed back out as a pellet. Now, it usually takes about 8 to 10 hours after the owl eats before a pellet is actually coughed or regurgitated back out. And scientists can actually learn a lot from these owl pellets. So scientists can document owl species by simply finding their pellets. So even if a scientist doesn't see the actual bird, if they find their pellet, that's a good indication that that particular owl species is in an area. So you can take a look on the image on the left. You can see a variety of different owl pellets from various different owl species. And teachers, feel free to pause the video to give time for students to observe the different owl pellets, to maybe compare and contrast the pellets and how they vary from each species. But also on the right, notice how an owl pellet will actually decompose over time. So if you're lucky enough to find a fresh owl pellet, it will be rather hard and more cylindrical in shape. And as time progresses, it will start to decompose and break down into smaller pieces. So you can see that owl pellets can last many, many years. It takes a long time for the fur and bones to decompose. So you can see what an owl pellet looks like here on the diagram 8 years later versus 16 years later. This is an owl pellet. Again, it's not poop. It's a regurgitated mass of hair and bones. And for Dallas ISD teachers, you can visit our DISD EEC website and order owl pellets for your class free of charge. Now, when you do your owl pellet dissection, it's going to come wrapped in some foil. All you do is just use your hands to remove the foil. I'm just going to use my hands to help me break open and investigate what's inside this pellet. But you can also use tweezers if you don't feel comfortable touching the owl pellet. I will say that the owl pellets have been sterilized in autoclave, so they're safe to touch. But as always, if you have concerns, again, just make sure you wash your hands after handling these. As I'm starting to break apart this owl pellet, I'm already starting to see some bones and other remains. I even found a skull. You can see those 2 long yellow teeth that probably came from a rodent skull. 2 more skulls that were found. Again, the most common thing you're going to find in these pellets are probably going to belong to the rodents. This owl happened to find himself some nice small mice to eat. And I know that these are rodents because they have these long yellow teeth. And as you're continuing with your dissection of your owl pellet, just remember to pull apart as much of that hair as you can, because a lot of times smaller bone fragments are hidden in that fur. So you might find bone fragments from part of an arm or a leg. You might find some claws, a jawbone, or teeth. And there's a collection of bones that I found there. There's actually 2 jawbones. So there's one jawbone right here, and there's another jawbone further down. We also have parts of the legs that you can see, maybe a shoulder blade. Here's another rodent skull. You can see the eye socket, the little tiny teeth here, and then the long front teeth or incisors. Again, here's a better close-up of the rodent skull. Now, my challenge for you guys is to see if you can identify these bones. Feel free to pause the video to allow more time to make observations. You might have to do some online research, either using owl pellet dichotomous keys or search for owl pellet bone identification charts. You can even use the one that I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation to see if you can match up some of these bones. And the reason that we're learning about owl pellets is because they are tied to the food chain or the food web. So a food web is just a collection of food chains. The living components in an ecosystem need the non-living components in order to survive. And we know that all energy in a food chain or a food web originates from the sun. So here we have the sun, that's the source of all energy. The sun provides energy to our producers. Later on in middle school, you might learn the word autotrophs. So producers and autotrophs are just the same thing. They are organisms that make their own energy. From the producers, we have what are called consumers or heterotrophs. Those are simply organisms that cannot make their own food. Instead, they have to eat other organisms to survive. So in our food web, we have a variety of different consumers. We have some foxes, chipmunks, the hawk, the owl, of course, and other birds. You guys are actually consumers too. You have to eat other things in order to survive. So our body doesn't make its own food. We have to eat other things. So we are examples of consumers as well. The next thing we have are what are called decomposers. So where do you think decomposers would fit in a food web or a food chain? Now, decomposers are very important. They're like the final link. So once the living organisms die, whether it's a producer or a consumer, once those organisms die, decomposers will then come in and help to break down the dead organic matter to return nutrients back into the soil. Examples of decomposers are things like the fungi, mushrooms, worms, and certain invertebrates like insects. Those decomposers are important to help return nutrients into our soil and just to help get rid of all the dead decaying matter. And we know that owl pellets are important for scientists and to learn about because pellets can help identify owl species in an area. By studying and breaking down an owl pellet, scientists can learn about what those owls have been eating. Pellets can tell us a lot about the diversity of prey available in an area, and scientists can track and document changes in diet and those causes. The most common thing that students find inside the owl pellets would probably be things like rodents. If you're lucky, you might find the remains of what's called a shrew, a mole, or even a bird. And that's all I have for you guys today on owl pellets. We're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman to answer any questions.
Maris, and a student named Emily from Bashir School asked a question. Do you have any chickens in your classroom? Well, if you heard Mr. Monroe's program this morning, you probably heard his chicken. Yes, our teachers do keep chickens as pets and also to use as a demonstration in the classroom. So the answer to your question, Miss Emily, is yes. And thank you for sending that question to us. And now Mr. Dominguez is going to tell us about changes in the ecosystem.
Hey guys, welcome to the EEC. In this portion of your virtual field trip, we are going to discuss changes in ecosystems. So here at the center, we have different populations of animals. We have pigs, we have goats, we have cows, chickens, ducks, all those wonderful farm animals that you've probably seen before here at the center. So let's pretend for a second that the EEC is an island, and this island, of course, is an ecosystem with a limited amount of natural resources that all these animals rely on. So let's say that we suddenly become overpopulated with a certain animal. Let's say cows, and these cows start overgrazing on the natural resources that other animals rely on. What would happen to the ecosystem? What would happen to the animals that live alongside the cows? Well, let's take a look at a couple of case studies to find out. Scientists have a pretty good idea of what happens when an organism overpopulates an ecosystem. We can take a look back at the case study of the reindeer at St. Matthew Island. In 1944, 29 reindeer were taken to a little island off the coast of Alaska to be used as a food resource for the Coast Guard that were stationed there during World War II. However, we know that the war ended, the Coast Guard left, but the reindeer were left behind. The reindeer thrived on this island because they had plenty of lichen and no natural predators. So that number of 29 quickly exploded to 6,000 reindeer in a very short period of time. However, this number would be their undoing. There's a little thing called carrying capacity, and carrying capacity is the number of organisms that can be supported by an ecosystem without causing environmental degradation. This number was met at this island. The lichen would eventually run out because of a couple of reasons. One, there was a bout of extreme weather during the 1960s, and two, there was just too many reindeer grazing on the lichen. So that natural resource would run out and would eventually cause the crash of this population of reindeer. There are no reindeer left at St. Matthew Island today. So unfortunately for these cows, if they did have an extreme increase in population and started overgrazing the grass that we have here at our environmental center, I think their population would crash just like the reindeer that we just talked about. So we would have plenty of cows go to cow heaven. So fortunately for these cows here at the environmental center, uh, their numbers are well within the carrying capacity of our ecosystem here. So these cows have nothing to worry about. But we forgot to talk about the other animals that live alongside the cows. So these animals, just like the cows, rely on the grass that those cows overgrazed. So if they ran out of natural resources and they had a die-off, what would happen to these little goats and pigs that also rely on those same natural resources as the cows? Well, I think they would probably meet the same fate as the reindeer that we discussed. And if in our hypothetical situation, if those cows were to die off, well, these animals would also lack the resources that they need to survive in our hypothetical situation. But like I said, here at the center, we have plenty of resources to go around. So these goats also don't have anything to worry about. So these are my pet isopods. You guys may know them as roly-polies. And I wanted to talk to you guys about something I've observed when their population becomes too large for their bin. So I keep these guys in plastic tubs. I provide soil, cork bark, leaves, all the things that they would need to thrive and reproduce. But I have to be very mindful of their numbers because at a certain point they start dying off. And why is that? Well, the resources I've provided for them become depleted and are no longer able to sustain the population that has grown in that plastic tub. So what I eventually have to do is split their numbers in half and place them in another tub. So even in micro ecosystems, in artificial ecosystems, carrying capacity is very important. So I love these little guys, so they have nothing to worry about. I give them plenty of resources for them to thrive. Changes in ecosystems can occur for a variety of reasons. Today, we mostly talked about what overpopulation does to an ecosystem's natural resources. They become depleted and cannot sustain the populations that call that ecosystem home. But before I let you guys go today, I want you guys to think of a number. And that number is 7 billion. That is how many human beings call this planet home. And unfortunately, our need for natural resources is currently and constantly changing the ecosystem. And those changes affect the organisms all around us. I want you guys to have a discussion not only about the effects that we are having on the environment and its organisms, but I want you guys to talk about carrying capacity. In biology, every species has a carrying capacity. And to remind you, carrying capacity is the number of organisms that an ecosystem can sustain without having severe environmental degradation. Have we reached our carrying capacity? I'll let you guys discuss that, but I will bid you farewell. Have a wonderful day until next time.
Okay, during this field trip, students observe the way organisms live and survive in their ecosystem by interacting with the living and non-living components, describe the flow of energy within the food web, and predicted the effects of changes in ecosystems caused by living organisms, including humans. Mr. Monroe did an ecosystem. Ms. Ram told you about food webs. Mr. Ramirez, owl pellet investigation. Mr. Dominguez, changes in the ecosystems. Thank you for joining us. If you would, teachers, go to www.tiny.cc/3-5 feedback, fill out a very short form and send it back to us. You guys enjoy the rest of this beautiful winter day, and we'll see you next time.